I'd like to share some background information about myself. I was raised by my mother, who is 50% Cherokee and 50% French. Us kids have never met her biological grandpa and believes in paranormal things, but tries to pretend they aren't there. My father is Scottish, English, German, and Jewish by blood. He, on the other hand, is 100% atheist and is rather skeptical about things he can't explain, and endeavors to be a logical and scientific person in all things. Due to major differences in personalities, beliefs, and values, they divorced when I was 8. She soon married my stepfather, who was a devout Southern Baptist from Mississippi, and basically gave up her identity as a native and became a God-fearing woman. Despite issues with my mother, my dad continued to let us visit with her mom and stepdad because he felt they were good people. They taught us many things about native culture, spirituality, legends, and the people. My grandmother and I spent a lot of time together, so I was given an opportunity to learn Cherokee medicine. My grandma comes from a long line of medicine women and men, and is one herself now. So many years later, at the ripe old age of 23, I am myself one of them. You now have some insight. About 2 years ago, my father, brother, and I moved into a new home, a little more in the country than our previous homes had been, something we all thoroughly enjoyed because we grew up immersed in nature and loved the land. Shortly after moving there, about 3 months in, I decided it was time to expand my family by getting myself a puppy. This would be the first dog that would actually be in my care. I've always had a strong connection to dogs, as my guiding spirit is a wolf, and after a while of searching, I came across a beautiful 5-month-old male German Shepherd Pit Bull mix. I went to meet him and instantly fell in love. He was the greatest, very sweet, kind to the cats, and protective of me, and became my best friend. Everything you could want in a dog. On this occasion in particular, we got a late-night visitor we weren't expecting. My dog woke me up in the night, this time around 2:45, and I wasn't ready, but dragged myself out of bed, clicked on the leash, opened the back door, and greeted me with a cool breeze. I rolled my eyes and went out into the yard with my pooch. He did his usual dog thing, sniffed around, jumped in the freshly cut grass, completely forgetting what we'd come outside to do in the first place. I whistled at him, recaptured his attention, and he got back to his business. He squatted, and I turned my head to the sky, offering some privacy. The moon was exceptionally large that night, almost full, but not quite. During this observation, I began to realize there was no typical nighttime noise around me. As if this wasn't unusual enough, I had a shiver go down my spine, and my arm hairs began to stand on end. That's when I heard my dog let out a low growl as he pinned himself against my legs. When I looked down at his tail, it was tucked and hackles were raised. When I tried to move, he pressed himself against me more. Another shiver came over me, and now I took the opportunity to follow where his eyes were looking. They were looking to what appeared to be a coyote, not totally uncommon in the area. We'd heard of them on many nights living here, but this was different. It looked different and felt different. The most frightening thing, however, was that it was looking right back at me. I didn't move. I didn't take my eyes off it. That's how I was able to see its features so clearly in the moonlight. Its fur looked thin, even bald in some spots. Its eyes were yellow, not reflective yellow like you see on a dog in the dark, but yellow like the sun, very powerful and almost blinding. Then looking more closely, I noticed its back legs were longer than a normal coyote. Longer than any canine creature should be, actually. Starting at the hips and going down, they seemed to look almost bipedal in design. That's when it dawned on me just what I was seeing. I picked up my 60-pound dog, never taking my eyes off the creature. As I did, I said a Cherokee prayer in my head that I had learned from my grandma. As if it were physically upset, it backed up slightly. And then I heard a voice that perfectly mimicked my grandma say, "Why would you do that to Makers?" No one aside from my grandparents ever called me that. It was their special name for me. With that, I darted for the door, dog still in my arms. I put him down and locked the door behind me. The noise must have awoken my brother because, when he came into the kitchen, or bothered, he asked me what was going on and why the dog was all riled up. I held my finger to my mouth and shut off the light. We then made our way into the living room, shut that light off as well, unlike something out of a horror movie. The outline of a tall humanoid thing shone through the stained glass window on the door, thanks to the bright moonlight. We both froze, and he made a grab for the knob when it started to turn, capturing it just in time to lock it. That's when it spoke to him, but this time in my grandpa's voice. "Bubba, why don't you let Grandpa in?" They live on the reservation in Cherokee, North Carolina. His face turned ghostly white and he turned to me. That's when I mouthed the word, and he paled even more. It began to tap on the glass, and we both went into my room and ignored the knocking. The next night around the same time, the tapping grew louder. We sat in the living room, praying to the Cherokee sun goddess, also called the Great Spirit, that it would go away. The tapping turned into knocks, which turned into pounding, the more we prayed. This must have awoken my father because he came downstairs, and we told him about the night prior during the day, and he didn't believe us, and thought it was just one of my brother's friends being an arse. So when he saw the silhouette in the window, he grew even more angry, made a beeline for the door, and we yelled at him not to open it. However, instead of harming him, it seemed to be afraid because it got down on 4 legs and disappeared down the road. My dad's face was pale as he stumbled back a few steps. He locked the door behind him, and we all went to bed. The next day, we spoke of the situation. I explained to him the natives call this creature a skinwalker. They aren't very common in Cherokee land. They're more of a Western native legend, but my grandparents still taught us about them. That being a skeptic just summed it up to a weird thing he could explain later. Later that day, I went to our local craft store and bought juniper ash, as my grandma instructed, and sprinkled it around our house. It never returned, but my dog was never the same after that night. It's as though the entire experience changed him. He went from a loving animal to mean and unpredictable. He started lashing out to anyone who wasn't female. We tried correcting it over the course of a year and a half, but nothing helped. He finally harmed my brother, causing him to bleed, and I was forced to find him a new home. Luckily, he is with a couple who are both female, and he seems much happier. But even to this day, I guarantee he won't go out at night. I didn't mention the name of the creature many times because it's considered a bad omen in native culture to give these things energy. If anyone is nervous, let me know, and I will happily walk you through a prayer ritual my grandma taught me. I hope you enjoyed unpleasant dreams. My family owns a lake house in North Georgia. We've had it as long as I've been alive, about 30 years now. It's off a secluded road in a small cove, and the neighbors only visit during the summer and spring seasons. Our lake house has been robbed before, as have our neighbors, and we didn't even know about it until weeks later. To put it in perspective and to show just how secluded this part of the lake is, for as long as I can remember, I've always had the most vivid nightmares and experiences at that lake house. Most of them include having a cryptid of some sort. I didn't know if these dreams had some real weight to them or not until a few years ago. I used to go up there before I moved out of my parents' house to blow off steam and spend some time alone, and occasionally smoke. I always went in the off-season during fall or winter for that extra effect of complete seclusion. The lake house itself is 2 stories and down a large hill. The tin roof is a steep A-frame and impossible to climb, save for a small partition over the master bedroom. You can only access that by a ladder on the left side of the house to clean the gutters. The front of the house has 2 large floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake and leads out to a 2-story deck over the water. If it wasn't for the seclusion, there would be little privacy due to these open windows. Not to mention, at this time, if there was no internet here and a cell phone signal is very limited unless you climb to the top of the quarter-mile-long driveway. I believe this was about 4 years ago. I went up to the lake sometime in late September to work on writing my novel and to spend some time alone. It was a normal day, gloomy and misty, and the water in the cove was all still as glass. At night, I could hear the remaining crickets and tree frogs of the season chirping in the night, just the way I loved it there. It was about 2 a.m. when I decided to go to sleep in the master bedroom. I'm a sound sleeper, but a loud bang on the roof above my head tore me out of my dream state, heart racing. It was like a gunshot on the tin above me, but I had heard that sound before, especially in storms. I assumed it was a large acorn striking the roof and calmed my nerves in order to fall back asleep. Then I heard it bend and wobble as something large had stomped upon it or landed, for that matter. It was still for at least 5 minutes, long enough for me to attempt to rationalize what it could have been. I then noticed the chirping outside had stopped. The metal warped again over my head. Something very large was moving across the roof. I could hear each dent in the tin. Another sound I can't quite describe, mixing with the sound of the tin, if I didn't know any better, sounded like hooves. I had never seen a deer at the lake house, despite its seclusion, and for a hooved animal to reach that area of the roof would have been impossible since it was 8 feet off the ground. I laid absolutely still in bed, hardly breathing, as I struggled to rationalize and swallow my fear. I always had a huge interest in the unknown and have experienced many strange happenings, some of the others which I will share in the future, but had always faced them with interesting confidence, never an ounce of fear. I consider myself to have good survival instincts, and in this time, my instincts were shouting danger to me. The metallic sound of the tin roof being compressed from a large weight continued as it approached over my head, and then I heard scraping. It was like nails on a chalkboard. I regained the ability to move as my instincts told me to get out of there, and I moved in slow motion as I slid out of bed and stepped on the floor, careful to not step on the creaking old floorboards and alert whatever was out there. I got on my hands and knees to crawl out of the bedroom into the main for a passing by the fireplace to do so. The sound was almost amplified as I crossed the open fireplace, a chimney, and I think I heard growling. It was very low and didn't exactly sound threatening, more so like a purse of sorts or a trail, but it was like nothing I had ever heard before. I crawled between the sofa and the coffee table, attempting my best to avoid the large windows. The meadow warped again, a loud sound as the metal popped into place as if the animal had jumped off from the couch. I could see from the open kitchen and the clock over the stove that it was nearing 4 a.m. I waited until 20 minutes had passed and I didn't hear anything else. At that point, I had time to use my rational thought and remember the times we had been robbed, as had her neighbors. Knowing no animal could have reached the roof, I assumed too had to be a home invader. I climbed the ladder. I remember my dad kept a BB gun in the tool closet on the other side of the lake house. My fear had left me, and all I was left with was adrenaline, in a rage, an instinct to protect my home. I got it from a hiding place and located the 20-year-old BB gun. The gun itself was rusted beyond belief, and I couldn't even load the damn thing. But it looked real, and that was all that mattered at this time. I gathered my courage and unlocked the door to the patio deck, and slowly creaked open the secondary storm door. Stepping out into the clear night, it was too quiet for my liking, but at least whatever it was seemed to be gone. I tiptoed barefoot to each side of the patio deck, peering over to my neighbors' dark homes and up the driveway. I used my phone flashlight to check my car in the driveway. No slashed tires or broken windows, thankfully. I turned off the flashlight and allowed my vision to adjust to the darkness before I gathered enough courage to raise the BB gun and slowly make my way down the dry, rotted patio stairs to the left wing of the house. The roofing above the master bedroom was empty, the ladder was still in place, and nothing was there. I was relieved and decided I needed to call it a night. The anxiety of the previous events wore me out. I walked back up the steps and went to re-enter the home when chills crept up my bare arms and hair was standing on end, a feeling paralyzing me in place as I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I held my breath inches away from the door, the large A-frame of the house towering above me, and I felt I needed to look up. I wish I didn't. As I backed up to get a better view of the steep A-frame, a black figure came into view perched on top of the steep roof. A black triangular head was attached to a large body much bigger than any man I had ever seen. The purring or trilling noise returned, and my heart thumped wildly in my chest. As my horrified gaze met a pair of glowing yellow eyes, I whipped open the storm door and pushed my way into the house. I slammed the door, bolted the lock, and ran to the guest bedroom on the other side of the house, the only one not having any windows. I shut the door and crawled into the lower bed of one of the bunk beds in the corner, clutching my phone and the BB gun to my chest. I don't even know how or what I managed to fall asleep. I woke up at 9 a.m., my neck aching and stiff from my awkward sleeping position of being huddled in the corner against the bunk bedpost. I hardly remember why I had the BB gun, but when I did, the familiar chills and adrenaline struck me. I found a more comfortable position in the bed and laid for at least an hour, wide-eyed, wondering if there was still anything out there. I finally had enough balls to leave the bedroom. My walk through the hallway required me to approach the large windows. It was a sunny morning, and I could faintly hear birds chirping. To my relief, I didn't need to go outside again to confirm that whatever it was had gone. I made myself breakfast and turned on the TV to watch a comedy movie on the VHS to calm myself even further. It was time to pack up and go back home, and I considered telling my parents about what had transpired last night. Knowing the previous times I had told them about the lake monster I believed resided in our cove, and the experience I thought I had with a ghost never went over well, so I decided to keep this story to myself until now. This really happened. It still gives me chills to think about. Before I left, I cleaned the house and loaded my car. I locked up the house and passed by the ladder on the slanted tin roof. I cleared leaves from the rungs and climbed up the 8-foot ladder and climbed onto the tin. It hardly caved under my feet. I weighed about 150 pounds at this time. As I examined the roof, there were no dents and no scratches. I was about to leave when I saw it. My heart clenched in a vice as I laid my eyes upon a large muddy print on the edge of the side gutter, each the size of a breastplate, oblong, rounded, and each split down the middle in a pair of cloven hooves. The events described here took place in a small country in northern Europe sometime between 2007 and 2008, during the middle of the summer. I was about 17 years old back then and spent a better part of this summer vacation helping my dad. He was a logger, and his workday, as well as mine, started very early in the morning. We would wake up just before 4 a.m., have a quick breakfast with coffee, dress up, get our gear, and drive out to the forest, which was around 15 to 20 kilometers away. My family lived in a rather small town surrounded by crop fields and forestry near the country's border, and the aforementioned trip meant you would get far enough from civilization. Poor, often disappearing cell signal, old overgrown roads, and absolutely no one who lives there. No one for you to meet on your way to the fella. That's what they call a territory where loggers cut trees. To get to it, we need to park our 4x4 truck on the side of a narrow road, walk 2 kilometers through thick overgrowth, and then climb down a steep hill. The route to this particular felling did stand out, though. On our way there, we would pass an old, long-abandoned house that got my attention the first time I made this trip with my father. Judging by the appearance of the house, it was built at least 80 years ago, definitely before Soviet occupation, which meant that it could have been nationalized with the original owners possibly being deported after 1940. All of the windows were gone, as well as the window frames. The roof was also gone, but you could still make out the individual rooms because the walls and the floor of this house were still somewhat structurally sound. You could also make out a yard that was hidden beneath the overgrowth. On one of our trips, I noticed some posters and magazines lying on the floor in one of the rooms. It was from around the 80s, so I figured that was the last time someone had lived there. It was quite unsettling to find this abandoned property in the middle of nowhere, but it was only after our 4th or 5th trip that I realized its probable importance. We got to felling trees, worked for about 3 hours, and decided to take lunch. It was a clear, sunny morning with no one around. My dad and I sat on one of the bigger trees that we cut down previously and proceeded to chow down on our sandwiches, taking occasional sips of coffee. Then it began. Suddenly, we both heard a dog barking somewhere in the distance. This was already weird since we never heard anything other than the ambiance of the forest the previous days here. What made this even stranger was the fact that the barking noise was coming from within the forest, the part we had yet to chop down and saw our way into. Me and my dad both stopped eating, looked at each other, and without saying a word, agreed that we would keep listening and turned our heads towards the forest from where the occasional bark was coming. I eventually said, "Must be a stray dog or something, or maybe someone lives nearby." My dad nodded in affirmation as we resumed our lunch. It became clear that the barking was nearing our position, and now it was accompanied by distinct human-like footsteps, breaking branches, shoving leaves, and so on. It unnerved me a bit, but I quickly realized that soon enough, somebody would definitely emerge from the forest, probably someone else who was logging near us. Although it would not explain the dog, as taking your pet to the felling trees would be very unusual, not to mention potentially dangerous for the animal. The barking continued, and the footsteps got louder and closer, close enough that both the person and the dog should be clearly visible. The sound stopped around 30 to 32 yards from where we sat, then resumed. Me and my dad kept looking in that direction and seeing absolutely nothing. The footsteps and the barking carried on. These sounds now came from a cleared-out area where we should not have been able to see anyone or anything that stood or moved. We looked at each other in complete bewilderment and didn't speak. I could even hear the dog hunting and sniffing around with an occasional step being taken by apparently no one. After 40 seconds, the sound indicated that this, whatever this was moving away from us, not back where it came from, but to the left. Soon enough, the sounds got very faint and disappeared. Me and my dad exchanged a few quick theories, but it was clear that neither of us understood what we had just experienced. We resumed work and left the place around the time we usually did, and I passed the house described earlier and got chills thinking that maybe what we witnessed is somehow connected to this haunting, abandoned property. I should state that we were both well rested that day and used to this type of work. This took place before I started using alcohol, and my dad had been a non-drinker all his life. I should also mention that neither of us is a skeptic. I have an open mind to these types of things, and they interest me. I've read up on it, but we certainly don't spend much time talking on it. This is one of the creepier things that has happened to me, and I often wonder if it was a ghost and his dog returning to their abandoned property. I've been sailing the seas for many years. I usually do so as a fisherman. That said, about 20 years ago, several fishing boats in the Atlantic had gone missing while fishing. We fishermen are a tight group, and we captains like to keep in close touch, both on and off the waters. There aren't many people who understand what it's like on the waters. Well, to make a long story shorter, I volunteered to head a crew out to sea while these boats were missing. Now, there's a lot of superstition that runs through sea captains. We hold a lot of beliefs that most who spend their lives on land simply wouldn't hold. So, while we figured it was something to do with the inclement weather or the like, there was still that creeping part of me that wondered what it felt more. I mean, 10 boats had gone missing in a short span of time, a few weeks really. A lot of the missing crew and captains were well seasoned, much like myself. It would stand to reason that there would have to be a reasonable explanation, or something else. We sailed the seas for about a week in search of what might be responsible for the disappearances, but we hadn't found anything yet. That said, at night there was a strange feeling. I describe it as ominous. For example, if you could breathe fear, that was the level of dread that hung in the air for what seemed like no reason at all. There was just something about the nights around the waters in the area that just felt off. 3 weeks into our investigation, one of our crew threw himself off the ship. We tried to go back for him, but once he was in the water, he never came back up. He just sank. If that wasn't startling enough, there was once or twice where our course had been altered by something that bumped us from underneath the waters. We weren't in an area with any land, and we weren't in icy waters, so something was in the waters themselves. I still remember the fear felt by myself and the crew both times that happened. It wasn't a massive shove, but it was enough to change our course, and enough for us to notice with a fairly large ship, so it would take something rather large in the water. Another week goes by, and I'm out on the deck one night to check a report. One of the crew members had been seeing a large eye in the water. Apparently I am superstitious, but I had to check this report out for myself as the guy giving it sounded stark raving mad. I checked on the man, and he swore to what he saw. I tried to assure him I believed him, but internally, I wasn't sure what to actually think. I mean, my crew would think I was crazy if I had said that I believed him. I kept a close watch on the waters until it was time to drop the anchor and sleep for the night. This is where things got really strange. Much of my crew had begun to lose it. They were skittish, and I could hear many of them pacing the halls. I kept my quarters locked because I felt unnerved. This is saying a lot, as before being out here, I would have trusted these men with my life. That feeling of drag came over me again, and that was a very unnerving quiet on the waters themselves. Then just as suddenly as it was there, it was gone. The men calmed, and everyone got some sleep. I eventually passed out from exhaustion myself, but was abruptly awoken by something in the night pounding at my door. I answered, and found my second-in-command telling me he lifted the anchor, and he was heading back, as he saw several of the crew walking willfully off the deck. I ran outside to go see what was up, and sure enough, about half of the crew had gone. One of the men I caught glimpses of was smiling as he did so. Shocked and disturbed by this, I gave the order to turn and head back home. The only thing stranger than the men willingly going off the side was the fact that once they did, they never came back up. It was like they hit the water and sank into the great beyond. As we were pulling away, though, I saw it once we had turned and we were leaving the waters. I saw a huge eye in the water, and it followed us for a short time before turning off and leaving on its way out. I swear I saw large tentacles. Not sure what to really make of it all, but we eventually made it back home and reported our losses. No one believed us or took us seriously within law enforcement. They believed everyone had gotten spooked and came under some kind of sickness and hysteria. Those of us who were there, well, we know better. I grew up in a household that I believe was haunted. The house was surprisingly large in Burnett, Texas. At the time that these stories were taking place, I was 6 years old. This house was a place that used to be a rodeo, and from what I've been told, I believe it's factual. Because when I grew up in the house, there was a full-scale kiddie train in the backyard with the complete train track, the conductor's booth, and the cars for everyone to sit in. At night, sometimes my mother would hear noises and see the silhouette of a man in a cowboy hat running down the hallway. By the time the man's silhouette would get to the other end of the hallway, it would vanish. Due to the fact that I'd never dealt with this story personally, I did not take any stock in the supernatural until much later in life. This next story took place at a trailer home in Ware, Texas. This home is 2 driveways down from the granary. That is part of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie film set. The truck from the original movie is still parked outside the granary. I was 13 at the time, and we lived on farmland and had roughly 37 goats and 2 guard dogs. There is a long strand of trees running along the length of a creek on the property, and a second row of trees running the same direction as the first, creating a fair-sized clearing at the back of the property, just before running into a massive wooded area. We started having an issue shortly after we got the goats that quickly took a turn for the worse. Over the course of 2 months, these goats began disappearing and getting picked off quickly. One day, while I was outside walking down the creek, I walked to the clearing by the back of the property. The grass in the clearing was high. It came up to my waist, and I saw the bloated corpse of one of our goats laying on its side, and a dog-like creature standing over it with its face down against the goat. It was still fairly far away, so I couldn't exactly see all of the creature nor its features, but it was large and had odd patches of gray and dark fur. I charged full speed at it, and as I got closer, I looked up, and when it looked at me, its closest resemblance was a hyena. It didn't have a tail, Its face seemed odd, and it ended up running away and disappearing somewhere. I couldn't see where it had disappeared to, and ended up leaving without taking a closer look at the goat. Looking back to better depict this animal, its back was tall and came up to my chest, making it about 5 feet. That was the only time I ever saw this creature. My next story occurred when I was 16, at my current abode. My mom had married my stepdad previously that year, and I kept getting eerie vibes at the house the longer I stayed there. Plus, my older stepsister had told me about the poltergeist that would throw her books across the room and flip through the pages vehemently. One night, I was relaxing in the game room and playing World of Warcraft by myself, sitting in a comfortable chair, when the radio turned to static at exactly 3 a.m. The fact that the radio turned on wasn't as scary as the fact that the remote for it had gone missing prior to us moving there, and that we had never found it. I was out looking at the radio, stood up, and walked directly towards the TV in front of me and turned it on. I sat there uncomfortably, talking to my online friends until after 4 a.m., then quietly stood up, turned off the TV and radio, and went to bed. A few years later, I went to bed one night still in the same house at a decent hour, and fell asleep on my back faced the ceiling. I woke up at 3 a.m. on the dot with an uneasy feeling, and without blinking, immediately noticed a massive figure standing over me. For reference, to the left of my bed was a bookshelf that was built into the wall and ran from floor to the ceiling. This shadowy figure, which was darker than the darkness of the countryside, was about 6 inches from touching an 8-foot-tall ceiling with his head. I kept my eyes open for a long period of time because I had the feeling that if I blinked, I wouldn't see him again. I looked at him closely and held my quick-drying eyes open for about 15 to 20 seconds, just staring at this shadowy mass on the wall. He was tall, slender, and had what looked like a hood on his head. And the closer I looked, the more I realized that's where the eyes should have been. There was a darkness that was somehow darker than whatever dark substance the rest of him was made from. Everything about his eyes was somehow the darkest part of him. After that span of seconds passed, I blinked. I could no longer see him, but had an uneasy feeling about being watched. I turned my back to him and went to sleep. The next year, my girlfriend at the time was sleeping over just after we watched that movie Paranormal Activity, and then we went to sleep next to each other. When we woke up, my girlfriend had 3 claw marks down her back for no apparent reason, and she told me she had a dream about a tall, hooded figure walking through the hallway and stopping to stare at her from the hallway. I never actually told her about my incident with the shadowy figure. 2 years after this, on my 18th birthday, me and my mom went down to 6th Street in Austin, Texas to get my first tattoo done. After discovering that they wanted to charge me nearly 4 times as much as the guy from my hometown for far worse quality, we left and ended up giving a homeless dude my money because he was honest about going to drink himself silly for the last call. We ended up driving back to Georgetown, Texas, and on the way, my mom suggested that we go ghost hunting with the phone application. We drove to a Pedernales electrical company right off IH-35 northbound in Ware, Texas. It was around 2:45 a.m. when we parked in their parking lot. We sat there trying to contact the spirit of a girl named Orange Socks, who was a Jane Doe whose name never got uncovered, and whose body was found dumped in the riverbed across the street from where we were parked. The application is a combination of a radar and a chat box where the ghost talks to you. I wasn't sure how I felt about the app initially. It just seemed like a quirky thing that wouldn't work. I told my mom there weren't any ghosts out there, and she decided to drive down the dirt road leading from the Pernadales, deeper into Ware. As she drove, I got uncomfortable and told her we should turn around and head home because there probably weren't any ghosts out there. As soon as I said that, the entire radar lit up green with hundreds of little orbs, and the text box began to work, translating like crazy. The application said frog blanket tennis, and I barely had enough time to roll my eyes at the building fear just before my mom stopped the car dead in a bridge that was barely a car's length long because a giant bullfrog, about a foot wide, hopped in front of the car. We both looked up and both saw what looked like a giant blanket flapping vigorously in the wind that didn't exist. Then we both witnessed it vanishing into nothing. My mom, being the supernatural white woman that she is, gets out of the car with a flashlight, much like Fred from Scooby-Doo, and starts to investigate. I, being absolutely freaked out at this point in the premonition, threatened to leave my mother if she didn't get her ass back in the car and drive. She complied, and we left to get a Whataburger on the way to our house. My nerves start to calm down, and I stopped feeling more at ease about the whole thing. So we step outside so I can smoke a cigarette, and I look over to the parking lot while we're chatting, and notice an oddly luminescent tennis ball perched casually at the corner of the parking lot. I start to get uneasy again and tell my mom we should leave. As we get in the car and drive towards the parking lot exit, there's another tennis ball right at the exit, then placed at the turning lane on our way home, then placed on the right street incrementally until our next turn. These tennis balls led all the way up to the gate of our house, which, unless you've been there before, is very hard to find, and I usually have to help guests find the place. I'm panicking now because my mom and myself are the only two people at home right now. Everyone else had gone on a 3-hour trip to the coast for the weekend. My mom pulls up to the house and we get out. Me being more cautious than her, I get out slowly and walk behind her. There are 2 electrical boxes for this house, and they're nowhere near each other, and all the lights are usually left on when we're not at home because of how dark it gets. When I say this is the only time the power has cut off in over a decade, I can't make this up. The power in the entire house cut off, and I ran as hard as I could until the lights came back on. Thinking back, there was probably a spot directly under the giant oak tree by our front driveway that looks like a giant cement slab gravestone. It has writing on it, but it's not readable from age and weathering. I drove this route the next day from my house back to Whataburger, and none of the tennis balls that had been there the previous night were there.